Okay, so welcome back. This is part 4 in our series on C# Visual Studio Windows Forms charts. And I encourage you to look at the first 3 videos in the playlist in the series. Those videos show you the basics of charts, what all the terminology means and how to configure them. And we make it very easy to understand and implement charts, which can be kind of confusing, but we clarify a lot of that stuff. We show you how to do cool stuff like make 3D charts and animate charts. So I really encourage you to look at that so you understand what's going on here. In this video, we're going to make it even easier to understand and implement charts. And to do that, we're going to develop our own C# Visual Studio's charts class. And basically what that does is it encapsulates all of the code you generally need to set up a chart or multiple charts. And it allows you to have a block of code in that class that you can just copy and paste to new applications. And it does all the configuration. All you have to do is give it a few parameters like axis, minimum and maximum values and that kind of thing. And it will go through behind the scenes and will configure everything for you like you see here and get you up and running, so then you can focus on actually doing the charting and gathering data. In the science, engineering, business world, charts are extremely important, so you really need to understand them. And it's nice to have a class where you can implement them very quickly because you'll find you need to use charts in just about everything. So as you can see here, we've got a simple Windows Forms with a chart, and it's got a primary y-axis on the left in blue and a secondary y2 axis in orange. And you can see that those orange values represent the orange series and the blue values represent the blue series. So there's 2 series and 2 axes, and you can see the axes are formatted. This has a 1 decimal point format on the Y2 and no decimal points. And we formatted the x-axis also. And you can see we've got some major grids and some minor grids. And this class will automatically format that. You just tell it what you want, and it goes through and generates all of those grid lines and formatting and everything. The other thing you might notice is that the primary axis, the y-axis, and the secondary y2 axis, the grid lines match. That can be a very challenging thing, and this class will do that for you. So it's really nice to have the same grid lines match on both axes so you don't get a lot of confusing grid lines. So let's take a look at how we can develop and implement this new chart class. So here we are in a very simple C# Visual Studio Windows Forms application. I've got my main form here. All I did is I drag and dropped a chart onto this form, added an exit button with an event handler, and that's about it. I haven't gone to the properties and changed anything, so it's just a regular chart. So here's our project over here. The only thing I did is I went to the project, right-clicked, and hit add, and added a new class. And that's what we're going to discuss in this video. And here is the class we're going to use. I've got some using statements: system, system drawing, system windows, forms, data visualization, charting. And all I've done is I've made this a public class, and I'm calling it line chart. A lot of times in engineering, I use line charts to view and analyze data. You can use bar charts, whatever you want. But a simple class, and I've got regions here with documentation. Fields, we've got some fields we're going to bring out so that we can access them with other parts of the class. A very simple constructor, and then we've got some methods. And there's 5 methods. And basically the way this class works is you instantiate it, it runs the constructor, and then if you want to configure any of the axes, you just call one of these methods. So for example, I've got an x-axis method, a y-axis method, a y2 or secondary y-axis method, and then 2 methods to auto-scale the y-axis or the y2 axis. Very simple. You just call these methods, feed it some parameters, and it will configure the corresponding axis however you want. So first let's take a look at the documentation. This class defines a line chart which has the following features: ability to define primary and secondary y1 and y2 axes, ability to do manual or auto scaling of y1 and or y2 axes, and ability to instantiate one or more instances of this class to configure multiple charts. If you have multiple charts on your form, you can use this class for each chart. Now the secondary Y2 axis, the Y2 axis method that we'll see down below adds a new series to the chart and configures the Y2 axis. When configuring the secondary Y2 axis grid lines, it uses the existing major and minor grid lines of the primary Y1 axis and doesn't draw its own Y2 grid lines. And again, that's so we can have the same lines for Y1 and Y2 axes. We just have to make sure that the intervals for the Y2 are appropriate based on the grid lines that it's borrowing from the Y1 axis. So it calculates a Y2 interval that corresponds to the Y1 grid lines. And at any time, the user can call one of the class methods autoscale Y or autoscale Y2 to do either manual or auto scaling of either of the Y axes. So that's it for documentation. We've got some fields here. We've brought out as doubles the primary Y-axis minimum value, Y-axis maximum value, and Y-axis major interval value, which are these values, the minimum, the maximum, and the major interval. And the reason is so that we can access with the Y2 axis, we can access those values and calculate what the corresponding Y2 axis intervals will be. So that's the way we brought them out so that we can access them for the Y2 axis. The only other thing we're going to do is define, so that it's available to all the axes, a font. A system-drawing.font, we're going to call it axis font, is a new font, and you can, in these parentheses, define the type of font, the size. You can add font style.bold or italic. So all of the possible font parameters you can define right here. And in our case, we're going to apply that one font to all the x-axis, the y-axis, and the y2 axis. Again, you can modify that if you want. So that's the fields. The constructor is very simple. Public line chart, and you pass it a chart, the one that you're working on, and all it does is it says, okay, the chart type is a series chart type.line, and the border width, or the line, the thickness of the line, unfortunately they call it border width, is 3. So when you drag and drop a chart, by default it starts out with a series 1, so we're going to assume it's just got the default series 1. We're going to set up the type and line thickness, and then we're going to clear the legends for chart 1, and that's it. That's all the constructor does. And then we have 5 methods that the user can call to configure the charts how he wants. All of these methods require that you feed it a chart. Whatever chart you're working on in your application, you might be working on 3 different charts, you can pass that chart as a parameter to any of these methods, and it will configure that particular chart. So each one of them, you feed it a chart, and you can see all 5 of these are the same thing, and then you feed it some values, some parameters, so it can configure the chart. So for example, on the y-axis, I can feed it a minimum, a maximum, a major interval for the major grid interval, whether you want minor grids enabled, a Boolean, and if you do, what is the minor grid interval? And you just feed it those values, and inside this method it will configure everything on that x-axis. Same thing on the y-axis. It's almost identical method. You feed it a chart, minimum, maximum, major interval, whether you want the minor grid enabled, and also what is the minor grid interval. Now, the one small difference in this y-axis is I'm going to have a little bit of math in here that allows you to, instead of specifying the absolute value of the minor grid interval, it will do it as a fraction. You can give it a number to make it a fraction of the major grid interval. So here is our application, and you can see here I've got a major grid interval every 5 steps on the y-axis, and I have set the minor grid to be half of the major grid interval. So you can see it's a half interval. I could specify every 2.5 in absolute value, but I did a little bit easier so you could make a fraction. But otherwise, the x-axis and y-axis methods do exactly the same thing. And then we have the Y2 axis. You can see we've set up a secondary or Y2 axis. And as we said before, we're going to use the same major grid intervals, which is these solid lines, and minor grid intervals for both the Y primary and the Y2 secondary axes. So we have to do a little bit of math to make sure that these are using the same intervals. Otherwise, we'll have a whole bunch of grid intervals for each axis. It'll be a bit of a mess. That's why we're not specifying what the major or minor intervals are, because we're going to just calculate based on the y-axis. So now let's take a look at these methods in detail. Again, we've got the x-axis configuration method, feed it a chart, min, max, major interval, Boolean for minor grid enabled, and then the double for the interval for the minor grid. So here we go. We've got the x-axis minimum is set to the minimum coming in, and same with the maximum, and same with the major interval is set to the x-axis interval. And then if the user wants the minor grid enabled, we grab the minor enabled, and then the interval is whatever is specified as the minor interval. And following that, we just set some defaults where we have a minor grid line color as color.dark gray. The line dash style, we want to have for the minor grid a dashed line. So we say line dash style equals chart dash style dot dash. And then the font is going to be our standard font that we defined up here in the fields, this axis font. So now we have configured the x-axis. The only other thing we can do is set the label style format. So the value of the x-axis is going to be a floating point with 1 decimal point. If you're going to do something like you're going to use date time for the x-axis, you can say format is, like you see here, hour, minutes, seconds, or whatever you want, but that just gives you an option to do that. And that's about it for the x-axis. And as you can imagine, the y-axis is going to be almost identical with a tiny change. So what we're going to do is we're going to grab the minimum, maximum, and major interval that the user inputs and apply those to these fields in the class so that we can access them for the Y2 axis. So y-axis minimum is the min, max, and major interval. And then we are going to say chart.series, series 1 chart type is chart type.line. And then the line width, the border width is 3, and the line color is color.blue. And then we are going to set the axis Y minimum, maximum, and interval to the values that came in from the user. And we're going to set the minor grid.enable to whatever the user wants. That's the minor enabled Boolean. And then the interval, what we're going to do is say the minor grid interval is a fraction of the major interval. And we're going to take the major interval, which came in from the user, and we're going to divide it by the minor interval fraction. So in this case, you can see we've got the major intervals every 5, and the minor is half of that. So we're going to take the major interval, which is 5, divide it by 2, and that'll give us 1 minor grid in between each major grid. So we take the major interval divided by the minor interval fraction, and if that's 2, it gives us 2 minor grids. And then we can set the minor grid color as color.dark gray, line dash style is chart dash style dot dash, because we want these minor grids to be dashed lines. And we're going to set the label style.font to our axis font we defined before. The for color is color.blue for the axis labels is going to be blue. And then we're going to set the label style format to F0 with no decimal points. And that's it for the y-axis. Now for the y2 axis, we don't have to worry about the major and minor grids because we're going to borrow that information from the y-axis. So we're just feeding in the chart, minimum and maximum. Here we're going to figure out how many major grid lines. And to do that, we're going to take the total range, the maximum minus the minimum, divided by the major interval, which is 5. So 30 divided by 5 means there's going to be 6. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So that way we can know how many major grid lines so that when we do this y2 axis, we know how to divide this total range, we're going to divide it by 6. So we're going to say major grid lines, convert to int32, y-axis max minus y-axis min, divided by y-axis major interval, which is 5 in our case. So this should give us 6 major grid lines, and we can use that later to figure out what the interval is. So since we're dealing with the y2 axis, we need to add a second series, series 2, because we have the default series 1. We're going to say the chart type is chart type.line, like the first one. The line width is 3. The color of the line is orange. The y-axis type is, this is very important, axis type.secondary, which means it will go onto this y2 secondary axis. And then we're going to define the y2 label style.font is the axis font that we already defined. The color of the label is going to be orange to match the line. The format's going to be F1 with 1 decimal point, as you can see here. And then we're going to define the minimum and maximas to whatever the user has sent in when calling the method. Now what we can do is figure out, like we said, we have to divide the total range. In our case, it's going to be 0 to 100. We got to divide that by 6, which is the number of grid lines, and that will give us the interval for our y2 axis. So it's max minus min, which is 100, divided by 6. So chart areas, chart area 1, axis y2, interval is going to be 100 over 6. So that's it for the axes. We're all set, and the only other thing we have is these auto scale. And these can be kind of challenging to remember how to do this, but basically you feed it a chart. If we want to auto scale the y-axis, we have to set the minimum, maximum, and intervals to a 0 or a double.nan, which is not a number. So you have to say axis y.minimums double.nan, maximum double.nan, minor grid interval double.nan, and interval equals 0. And that will automatically set this to auto scale. And you can do this in real time or whatever, but that's how you auto scale the y. The y2, we don't have to worry about the grids. We just have to say the axis y2 minimum and maximum are double.nan. And that's it for the class. It's got some methods that you can access. You can add methods however you want, but that's about it for how the class works. Now the form itself, the application, all we've got is 3 lists of doubles which have the x values that you're going to plot, the y values, and the y2 values. And we are going to have a method here to just fill those lists with numbers, however you want to do it. So we've got our public form 1 initialized component. We generate those values. We call that method. And all it does is it adds some random values to those 3 lists of doubles. So we have something to plot. And then we start to use this class, the line chart class. First thing, we instantiate a line chart class, call it line chart as new line chart, and we feed it this chart 1 that we've drag and dropped onto the form. And we're going to call 3 methods here to configure the x-axis, the y-axis, and the y2 axis. So in each case, we're going to feed it this chart 1 that we're using. So the x-axis we're going to feed to the chart is going to be minimum 0, maximum 10. The interval, the major grid interval, is going to be 5, and we do want a minor grid, and that's going to be every 1 value. So you've got 0 to 10, major grid 5, and every 1, it's going to give us a minor grid. Same with the y-axis, feed it the chart, minimum 0, maximum 30. 5 is going to the major interval, and we're going to enable the minor. It's going to be half of whatever this major grid interval is. We're using 2, so it's going to divide by 2. So you can see 5, so divide by 2 is 2.5. So that's a nice way to get to know how many minor grids you're going to have. And then y2 axis, since we don't have to do the grids, all we have is chart 1. We're going to pass it. It's going to go from 0 to 100, and it's going to use the same grids. 100 divided by 6, which is going to be 16.7 for each major grid. And it's going to use the same minor grids. So that's about it for the application. A very nice way to make charting a whole lot easier. You can modify this however you want. But that's it for this one. If you're liking these videos, I encourage you to hit the like button, subscribe, hit the bell notifications. But most of all, please let others know that we're here so we get some views. Really appreciate it. Otherwise, take care. Have a really good day. Thanks.